My name is Catherine Kate Anderson. I'm 28, and the moment my sister, Veronica Ronnie Anderson, told me I should hand over my inheritance because she had a family, something in me went cold instead of breaking. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself the way I had my whole life. I booked a flight to Seattle, closed my laptop, and let her keep talking while I stared at the confirmation email like it was proof that I could still leave before they buried me under another round of guilt. A few hours later, my mother texted that if I didn't transfer the money, I shouldn't even think about coming back to our family home in the suburbs of Chicago. My father called right after, his voice low and sharp, telling me I should know my place. That phrase stayed with me because people only tell you to know your place when they've already decided it's beneath them. By midnight, I had changed passwords, frozen shared access points, flagged every account connected to Grandpa's estate, and locked down everything they assumed they could pressure, manipulate, or simply take. When my phone lit up again, I let it ring. Then again. Then again. By 2:00 the morning, I had 43 missed calls and one voicemail from my mother that I still couldn't bring myself to play. I knew whatever was in that message would not be concern. It would be rage, panic, or the first sign that they were losing control. And the truth is, what happened after that voicemail was worse than anything they had said to my face. Before I tell you what was in it, and what I found out the next morning, tell me, what time is it for you right now? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like there? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. I didn't play the voicemail until I reached SeaTac Airport. I was sitting near my gate with a paper cup of burnt airport coffee in one hand and my carry-on by my feet when I finally pressed play, mostly because I wanted to stop imagining it. My mother's voice came in shaky at first, but not with sadness, with anger barely held together. She said I was humiliating the family, that my sister Ronnie was crying, that I was acting like a stranger over money that never should have been mine alone. Then her tone changed. She told me I was making a dangerous mistake by forcing everyone to get formal. That word hit harder than the rest. Formal meant lawyer. Formal meant they had already moved past guilt and into strategy. I boarded my flight without calling back. Somewhere over the clouds, I opened the estate email again and reread every document the lawyer had sent. My grandfather, a retired history professor from a small college in Illinois, had left me his house in Evanston, the savings account attached to the property sale he never completed, and a private letter marked for me only. I hadn't opened the letter yet. I told myself I was saving it for when I had the strength, but the truth was, I was afraid it would make everything real. By the time I landed in Seattle, where I had impulsively booked 2 nights just to create distance, I had 6 new texts from my sister, Ronnie. The first called me selfish. The second said I was stealing from her children. The third said I had no right to keep what I didn't need. The others escalated from there. She told me I had always been bitter because I didn't have what she had: a husband, 2.5 kids, and a PTA membership. She said Grandpa must have been confused. She even implied I had manipulated him in his final months, which would have been laughable if it weren't so vicious. I checked into a hotel near the Seattle waterfront, drew the curtains, and finally opened Grandpa's letter. It was only 2 pages, written in his uneven, deliberate handwriting. He said he knew exactly what he was doing. He said he had watched this family measure worth by usefulness for too long. He said I had been treated like the one expected to understand, wait, adapt, and surrender. He wrote that I was the only person who had ever sat with him without asking for anything. And then came the line that made me put the letter down and stare at the wall for a full minute. By the time you read this, they may already be telling you that love means handing yourself over. It does not. I wish I could say that gave me peace. What it really gave me, tsandare, tunity, can be brutal, because once you see what's happening, you can't pretend anymore. That evening, the estate lawyer, Daniel Mercer, called me personally. His first question wasn't whether I was okay. It was whether anyone besides me had access to Grandpa's home office, banking mail, or his external files. When I asked why, he paused just long enough to tell me something was wrong. Someone had already tried to contact his Chicago office that morning, claiming they were representing the family's shared interest in the estate. It wasn't a lawyer. It was my father. And according to Daniel, he sounded very confident for a man whose name was nowhere on the will. Daniel told him there was no shared interest, no ambiguity, no family claim, and no legal basis to challenge the inheritance, unless they could prove fraud or incompetence, which the medical and legal records did not support. My father had hung up on him. Then Daniel added one more detail. Less than an hour later, someone called the bank asking what documents would be required to assist an overwhelmed beneficiary with urgent transfer arrangements. He couldn't prove it was my family, but he didn't need to. I knew. They weren't asking me anymore. They were trying doors to see which one had been left unlocked. That night I sat on the hotel bed with Grandpa's letter folded beside me and realized this was no longer about inheritance. It was about access. They had never been angry that I had money. They were angry that for the first time, I had control over something they wanted, and families like mine could forgive almost anything except that. I flew home to Chicago the next day, but not to my apartment downtown. I went straight to my grandfather's house in Evanston, the one everyone kept referring to as if it were already a resource waiting to be divided. The moment I pulled into the driveway, I saw my father's Cadillac parked across the street. Not in front of the house, not openly, across the street. Half hidden beneath a maple tree, like he wanted plausible deniability if I caught him watching. I didn't confront him. I parked, went inside, and locked the door behind me. The house smelled like cedar and old books, and the last stable memory I had of being cared for without conditions. Grandpa had never been warm in the sentimental sense, but he had always been precise, and there was something comforting about the way he kept things. Nothing in that house was careless. I walked room to room, checking drawers, cabinets, the office, the filing cabinet. Two things were immediately obvious. Someone had already been inside before me, and they had not been subtle. A desk drawer in the office had been forced just enough to splinter near the handle. A box of labeled folders had been put back in the wrong order. One closet shelf was empty except for dust outlines where small lock boxes had once been kept. I called Daniel from the hallway and told him everything. He instructed me not to touch anything until he could send someone. Then he asked whether any family members had spare keys. I almost laughed. My family didn't need keys when they had trained themselves to believe every door would eventually open for them. Within 2 hours, a locksmith arrived, followed by a private investigator Daniel apparently used for sensitive estate disputes. Hearing those words attached to my own life made me feel like I had wandered into some grim, alternate version of adulthood where boundaries required professionals and invoices. While they worked, I sat on the back porch and called Mia, my best friend from college, who had spent years watching me excuse behavior that would have sounded absurd if it had happened in any other relationship. She didn't waste time soothing me. She said what she always said when I tried to minimize things. Kate, normal families don't panic because one daughter finally says no. Later that afternoon, the investigator found something in the trash bin near the garage, a printed property valuation estimate for the house dated 2 weeks before my grandfather died, not after, before. The estimate had handwritten notes in the margin. Quick sale, as is. Likely investor interest. Ideal transfer window. There was no signature, but I knew Ronnie's handwriting. I had stared at birthday cards and passive-aggressive Christmas notes in that slanted script for years. My sister had been planning the liquidation of a house that was never hers while Grandpa was still alive. That discovery should have made me furious, but what I felt first was humiliation. Not because of what she had done, but because a part of me still wasn't surprised. That was the hardest truth of all. Deep down, I had always known exactly what they thought of me. I just kept hoping love would interrupt greed before greed had a chance to fully introduce itself. I was wrong. At 6:00 that evening, Ronnie finally showed up in person. She knocked once, then let herself try the handle, then knocked harder when it didn't open. I stepped into the front hall, but didn't unlock the door. Through the glass panels beside the entry, I could see her expression switching between outrage and performance. She looked immaculate, as always. Hair perfect, makeup clean, soft, neutral sweater, chosen to make her look reasonable, maternal, wounded. She mouthed, "Open the door." I shook my head. Then she pulled out her iPhone and called me while standing on my porch. I answered just to hear what mask she'd choose. She started with disbelief, like she couldn't imagine being treated this way by her own sister. Then she pivoted quickly. She said I was making this uglier than it needed to be. She said there were realities I refused to understand. She said having a family changed everything, as if motherhood had converted entitlement into morality. When I told her Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing, She snapped and asked whether I really believed an old man in pain would make such a cruel choice on purpose. That was the first time she miscalculated. Cruel choice, not unfair, not unfortunate. Cruel, because to Ronnie, any decision that centered me had to be an act of aggression against her. I told her I had found the valuation papers. There was silence for 2 full seconds. Then she recovered and said she had only been trying to help in case things got complicated. I asked, complicated for whom? She hung up. 10 minutes later, my mother called crying so hard, I almost answered out of habit. But I let it go to voicemail. Then my father texted one sentence that told me everything I needed to know. You are destroying this family over pride. Pride. Not theft. Not intrusion. Not coercion. Pride. Because in families like mine, self-protection was always renamed arrogance whenever it disrupted the roles assigned to us. That night, after the locksmith changed every exterior lock and the investigator documented the office, I found another envelope tucked behind a row of old history books. It was addressed to me in Grandpa's handwriting, but smaller than the first, almost hidden. Inside was a note and a flash drive. The note said, "For when they insist memory belongs to the loudest person in the room." I stared at that sentence for a long time before inserting the drive into my laptop. The first file was audio. The second was a scanned journal page, and the third was a recording dated just 11 days before Grandpa died. I pressed play. The voices in that recording changed everything. The first voice on the recording was Grandpa's, tired but clear. The second was Ronnie's. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, while her words filled the room with the same polished contempt I had grown up around, but never had proof of. She was telling him, in a tone she probably thought sounded practical, that it made no sense to leave anything substantial to me. She said I was unstable, isolated, and likely to waste the opportunity because I had no husband, no children, no structure. She said assets should go where they would matter. Then she laughed lightly and added, "You know, Kate, she'll act strong, but she folds when pressure is applied." I replayed that line 3 times, not because I doubted it, but because I needed to hear exactly how easily she said it. That's the thing about betrayal when it finally comes with evidence. It doesn't always shock you. Sometimes, it just removes your last excuse for staying blind. Grandpa's response was calm enough to cut. He told her a family was not a reward system. He said I had already carried more than anyone knew. He said if she ever wanted to understand why he trusted me, she could start by asking herself why she assumed everything had to serve her. Ronnie didn't apologize, she cried. Then she accused him of punishing her for building the life everyone claimed to value. My mother entered halfway through the recording, and hearing her join in made my stomach turn. She said Grandpa was creating division. She said a balanced distribution would prevent conflict. Grandpa replied, "Conflict already exists. You simply prefer when Catherine pays the bill for it." I had to stop the audio there because my hands were shaking too hard to keep listening. That one sentence rearranged my entire life. It named the role I had been forced into without anyone ever saying it directly. I was the absorber, the adjuster, the one who was supposed to make unfairness look like peace. The next morning, Daniel arrived with copies of additional estate documents and a look on his face that told me the situation had escalated again. Someone had contacted a local Chicago real estate agent, claiming they were preparing the property for listing after an internal family resolution. The agent got suspicious because the title records hadn't updated publicly yet and asked for authorization. Daniel intercepted it through one of his contacts. When he told me, I wasn't even angry anymore. Anger had burned into something cleaner. Strategy. We spent the next 2 hours making a list. Formal notice of unauthorized interference. Written warning to all parties. Security cameras installed that day. Mail hold. Bank notification. Digital freeze. And a statement prepared in case any false claim about my grandfather's mental state surfaced. I signed everything without hesitating. That afternoon, while technicians mounted cameras around the porch and side entrances, I walked through the house again, not as a confused granddaughter clinging to memory, but as its legal owner. Every room felt different, not softer, stronger. In the dining room, I found the old sideboard where my grandmother used to keep table linens. In the bottom drawer, beneath yellowed napkins and tarnished serving pieces, there was a small leather-bound journal. Most of it was Grandpa's notes about ordinary things. Weather, medication, the garden, names of books he wanted to reread. But several pages referenced family visits. Not long, emotional entries, just clipped observations. Ronnie asked about Deed again. Carol says Kate is independent, meaning expendable. George assumes peace requires one daughter to lose. The words weren't dramatic, which made them devastating. He had seen everything. He had simply stopped arguing with people committed to misunderstanding him. That evening, I did something I had never done before. I called my parents and asked them to meet me at the house the next day, along with Ronnie. Not to discuss, not to negotiate, to listen. They arrived at noon, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel smaller when all three of them stood in front of me together. Ronnie came in already offended. My mother carrying hurt like a costume she expected to be admired. My father grim and impatient. He snorted, and asked whether I was ready to stop playing games. I told him to sit down. Then I put Grandpa's recording on the speakers and let the room hear itself. No one interrupted at first. Ronnie went pale. My mother's face hardened in stages. My father stared at the floor until his own voice entered the audio from a later section, him telling Grandpa that I was used to doing without, and that letting me keep everything would only encourage distance. When the recording ended, silence settled so heavily it felt physical. Ronnie was the first to speak. She said it was out of context. Of course she did. My mother said Grandpa had been emotional and easy to influence near the end. Daniel, who had quietly remained in the next room until that moment, stepped forward and introduced himself, before informing them that any further attempt to interfere with the estate, access the property, contact financial institutions, or misrepresent my authority would be documented and pursued. My father looked stunned, not because of the warning, but because it had come from a man in a suit instead of a daughter they could talk over. Ronnie began crying, truly crying this time, and asked how I could humiliate her like this. That question almost made me laugh. Humiliate her? As if exposure were the same as cruelty. As if the truth becoming public inside one living room was harsher than years of private erosion. I told them all the same thing. This conversation was over. No one was getting access to the house. No one was getting money. And if they contacted my employer, my bank, my neighbors, or anyone connected to the estate again, I would stop handling this as a family problem and start handling it as harassment. My mother whispered, "You would do that to us?" And I said the one sentence I should have said 10 years earlier. No, I would do it for me. They left in pieces of outrage, disbelief, and wounded ego. When the door shut behind them, I expected to collapse. Instead, I felt strangely still. That night, I wrote the first honest sentence I had ever put on paper about my family. They were never shocked that I was hurt. They were shocked that hurt had finally become expensive for them. In the weeks that followed, the house became both refuge and evidence. I renovated it room by room, but I also cataloged every document, letter, and receipt. Daniel warned me not to underestimate desperate people once guilt stopped working, and he was right. Ronnie changed tactics first. The crying and moral lectures stopped, replaced by a quiet smear campaign. A cousin texted asking if I was really okay after everything with Grandpa. An aunt hinted I was isolating and acting irrationally. Someone had begun telling relatives that I manipulated Grandpa while he was medicated, that I cut the family off out of paranoia, and that I planned to sell the house out of spite. Ronnie was building a story I knew too well. Unstable single woman inherits unexpectedly, turns cruel, rejects her loving family. It worked because it leaned on assumptions people were already comfortable believing about me. Mia wanted me to expose everything immediately. Daniel told me to wait. Liars get sloppy when they think they're winning, he said. He was right. 3 days before a so-called peace dinner my mother insisted on hosting at their house in Hinsdale, Daniel called to ask whether I had authorized any loan inquiry against the property. I said no immediately. Someone had submitted preliminary information to a private lender suggesting the house would soon be folded into a family trust to support a dependent household, Ronnie's. I went cold. She had not only expected the house, she had tried to build financial plans around it. Daniel shut it down, but by then I stopped seeing this as family dysfunction. It was predatory. I still attended the dinner, not for reconciliation, but to see how far they would go face to face. My parents' dining room looked exactly the same as always, polished and staged with Ronnie, still at the center of every framed memory. I arrived with copies of the lender inquiry in my bag. My mother tried to begin with prayer. My father wanted a respectful reset. Ronnie immediately shifted to her children, her stress, her burdens. I let them speak, then placed the documents on the table. My father read them first, and for the first time I saw something like alarm cross his face. Ronnie denied understanding them, then admitted she had only been exploring options. Then insisted she assumed I would eventually do the right thing. I asked her one question as calmly as I could. At what point did you decide my life was collateral for yours? She had no answer. My mother cried again. Not because of what Ronnie had done, but because the evening was turning hostile. Exposure always became aggression in her version of reality. I stood, told them the dinner was over, and said that if anyone approached the property, the bank, a lender, or an agent again, I would file formal complaints by name. My mother said I was threatening the family over paperwork. I told her no. The family had threatened me over money and called it love. In the driveway, my father followed me out and quietly asked whether I really meant to cut everyone off forever. I told him forever wasn't the point. The point was that access to me was no longer guaranteed. He said I was punishing everyone for one bad season. I looked at him and realized that parents like mine survived by calling a pattern a season. This didn't start when Grandpa died, I said. It just stopped being hidden. A week later, the consequences finally began landing where they belonged. The lender Ronnie contacted flagged inconsistencies and apparently reached out to her husband because some of the submitted information involved joint liabilities. He discovered she had been trying to position herself around property that was never hers. The story she had told him, that the inheritance was still undecided and that I had informally agreed to help, collapsed in a single afternoon. Then came the relatives. One cousin forwarded me a voice note Ronnie had sent in frustration, complaining that I had always been easy to corner, and that she couldn't believe I was suddenly acting like a lawyer. That note spread faster than any defense I could have made. By the end of the month, I heard Ronnie's husband had moved out temporarily. My mother blamed stress. My father blamed misunderstanding. I blamed Ronnie's lifelong certainty that consequences were for other people. And even then, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something colder and clearer. I felt the end of illusion. Autumn settled quietly around the house, and for the first time in my adult life, peace did not feel like an apology waiting to happen. I built routines. Coffee on the porch, work calls from the study, evenings spent sanding wood or reading in the room that had once belonged to my grandparents. Mia visited often. Jason, who had begun as a friend from work and somehow become the one person who never asked me to shrink for comfort, helped me rebuild the back fence on weekends. The neighbors learned my name. April next door brought over soup when I looked tired. The life I had always been told was empty because it didn't resemble Ronnie's turned out to be full the moment I stopped defending it. The fallout didn't disappear, though. It simply changed form. My parents stopped calling daily and began sending long emails instead. The kind written by people who want credit for vulnerability without surrendering control. My mother wrote that families say awful things under pressure. My father wrote that pride had cost all of us more than money ever should. Neither one used words like apology, intrusion, manipulation, or wrong. They circled the wound without naming the knife. Then Thanksgiving approached. In my family, holidays had always functioned like staged truces that erased damage without resolving anything. Whoever had been hurt most recently was expected to show up smiling to prove they weren't bitter. My mother emailed to say the door was open if I wanted to come home in the spirit of healing. 2 hours later, Ronnie sent something shorter and crueler. Enjoy your little house. Let's see how warm it feels when nobody wants you in the end. I stared at that text for less than 10 seconds before blocking her number for the first time. Not muting. Blocking. It felt ceremonial. Jason suggested I spend Thanksgiving somewhere else, somewhere free of history. But I didn't want absence. I wanted replacement. I wanted new meaning in the exact season that had always been used to disguise obligation as gratitude. So I invited Mia, Jason, April's teenage son, and 2 elderly neighbors from down the block who had nowhere to go that year. I cleaned for days, cooked too much food, bought extra candles, borrowed folding chairs, and set the table with my grandmother's dishes, because hiding beauty out of fear felt like another kind of surrender. On Thanksgiving morning, my mother sent one final message. Last chance to do the right thing. It didn't mention missing me. It mentioned morality because that was always the language of obedience in my family. I didn't answer. By afternoon, my house was warm with voices, clattering plates, and the kind of laughter that doesn't require anyone to be diminished for the room to feel alive. April brought pumpkin pie. Mia brought a nice bottle of Cabernet. Jason stood beside me in the kitchen drying dishes, as if he had always belonged there. At one point, I looked around the room and thought, this is what love looks like when it isn't organized around hierarchy. We were halfway through dessert when Daniel texted me. Just a heads up. Your sister may be in deeper financial trouble than they admitted. Apparently, she relied on expected support that never materialized. I set my phone face down. Minutes later, the doorbell rang. The room went quiet. I opened the door and found my parents on the porch, both looking more worn down than I had ever seen them. Behind them, parked at the curb, was Ronnie's SUV. She stayed inside. My father asked whether they could come in. My mother started crying before I answered. She said Ronnie's marriage was in crisis. She said debts had surfaced. She said things had spiraled farther than expected. Then came the line buried beneath every message before it. We need help. Not we miss you. Not we were wrong. We need help. I asked whether they were here for Thanksgiving or for money. Neither answered right away, which told me enough. My father finally said softly, both. Maybe. My mother tried one last angle. She said family should not turn each other away in hard times. Behind me, I could hear Mia moving dishes, Jason speaking softly to April, the ordinary sounds of people who cared without calculation. I stepped outside, pulled the door nearly closed behind me, and listened as they explained that Ronnie might lose the house she and her husband rented in a nice Chicago suburb, that the children were confused, that surely I did not want innocent kids to suffer. There it was again, root guilt through the vulnerable. Make refusal look monstrous. I looked at both of them and understood something final. They still did not see me as someone whose suffering had ever counted the same way. I was the reservoir, the backup plan, the daughter whose purpose resumed the moment the preferred child failed. And after that my answer came easily. I told them no. Not loudly, not cruelly, and not with the trembling guilt they expected. Just no. My mother blinked like the word itself was foreign. My father inhaled as if he was about to reason with me, but I stopped him. I said I was done being treated like emergency funding with feelings. I said Ronnie's choices were not my debt. I said children deserved stability, but so had I. And no one in this family had ever defended that truth with half the passion they used when money was involved. My mother cried harder. She said I was punishing them. I told her consequences and punishment were not the same thing. Then I said the sentence that had been building in me for months. You chose Ronnie every time there was a cost. Now you want me because the bill finally came due. My father looked away first. That mattered more than any apology he still didn't give. He asked whether there was truly nothing I was willing to do. I said there was one thing. I was willing to stop pretending this family had ever functioned on fairness. I was willing to tell the truth. I was willing to leave the door open to accountability, but not to access, not to money, not to the version of reconciliation where I save everyone and we call it healing. My mother asked if that meant they could never come back. I told her they could come back when they were ready to speak to me without asking me to disappear inside the conversation. She didn't understand. Maybe she never would. Behind them, Ronnie finally stepped out of the SUV. Even in the porch light, I could see the damage in her face. Mascara smeared, posture collapsed, all the polish that once worked as armor now hanging off her like something borrowed. She didn't come all the way up the walk. She stayed near the gate and said my name once. Not like a sister, not quite like an enemy either. In that moment, I saw all the years between us at once. The birthdays where her wishes mattered more, the holidays arranged around her moods, the whispered excuses for her cruelty, the endless chorus telling me to be patient, be understanding, be the bigger person, be less visible. I realized saying no tonight was not one decision. It was the accumulation of every silence I should never have swallowed. Ronnie asked if I was really going to let her children pay for this. I gave her the only answer I could live with. Your children are paying for your decisions, not mine. She flinched. My father closed his eyes. My mother said Grandpa would be heartbroken to see us like this. And I almost laughed because the lie was so instinctive it had become ritual. Grandpa saw us exactly like this, I said. I was just the last one willing to admit it. No one argued. They couldn't. The recordings, the letters, the months of pressure, too much had already been dragged into the light. I took the folded note Grandpa had hidden behind the books and read one line aloud. Memory belongs to the person willing to keep it honest. Then I looked at all three of them and said, for the first time in this family, That person is me. I wish I could say they apologized then, the kind that costs pride and changes behavior. They didn't. My mother whispered my name like she was the one abandoned. My father said they should go. Ronnie stood still for a moment, as if movement itself would confirm defeat. Then they turned and walked back to the car together, not repaired, not united, just unable to force the old pattern to resume. I watched until the taillights disappeared. Then I went back inside. No dramatic collapse, no tears in the hallway, just warmth, soft music, Jason looking at me with quiet concern, Mia holding my wine glass out before I even asked. I took it and sat back down at my own table, not theirs, mine. In the weeks after Thanksgiving, more truth surfaced. Ronnie's husband filed for legal separation. Several relatives distanced themselves after hearing the recordings and voice notes. My parents, according to one aunt, were considering selling their second car and dipping into retirement savings to help Ronnie stabilize. For years, they had protected her from consequences by rerouting those consequences through me. Now, with me gone from the equation, reality had nowhere else to go. As for the house, I kept it. I finished the renovations. I turned Grandpa's study into a consulting workspace, and the spare room into a reading room lined with shelves. Months later, while sorting the last archived documents Daniel returned after probate closed, I found one final surprise. A small investment account Grandpa had structured to transfer separately after all disputes ended. It wasn't enormous, but it was enough to matter. I thought about what my family would say if they knew. Destiny, obligation, fairness, need. Instead, I used part of it to repair April's roof after a winter storm she couldn't afford to handle alone. I funded a scholarship at the community college Grandpa used to support quietly. I kept the rest invested in my future where it belonged. And maybe that was the ending they never saw coming. Not that I refused to save them, but that I stopped believing love had to look like surrender. So when people ask whether I regret saying no to my sister when she demanded my inheritance because she had a family, I tell them the truth. No was the first honest inheritance I ever accepted. And if one day my parents call again, or Ronnie appears wanting redemption dressed as urgency, I already know what I'll do. I'll listen for one thing only, the presence of truth without a price tag attached. Until then, the door stays closed. Not because I'm bitter, but because I finally learned that peace is not something you beg for in the houses of people who only value you, when you're willing to empty yourself for them. At Pro Revenge Stories, our team is committed to creating meaningful and engaging stories that resonate with viewers. We want to make it clear that this channel shares fictional stories designed to deliver valuable life lessons and positive educational messages to our audience. The villain in this story is especially frustrating because they hide selfishness behind the excuse of family and responsibility. Their actions show how manipulation and entitlement can damage trust and destroy relationships. After hearing this story, how would you deal with a character like this if you were in the main character's place?